But later on it was changed. Now, in the early days of the Christian church, as I said, it was limited to a minority of a poor layer of society. But as the Roman Empire entered into crisis, like all class societies that enter periods of crisis, we have it today, actually. You have the Jehovah's Witnesses who go around knocking on doors and telling you that, you know, you'll see your dead children one day, and all this kind of stuff. And they prey on what I consider to be unfortunate people who've had some problem in their life, and they promise them all kinds of stuff. And you have these new born-again Christians and all kinds of new churches developing in a period in which society today is in crisis. There's a serious crisis of the capitalist system, and some people, if you remember in the year 2000, the end of the world is nigh and all this kind of stuff, that's been many times. When society is in crisis, the idea that the world is going to end, the world is not going to end. What is going to end is a particular form of society which is in crisis. And within the Roman society, even at a certain point, even amongst the higher layers, the wealthier layers, a desire for something better than the world, the degenerate world in which they lived as the Roman Empire sank deeper and deeper into the morass. And at a certain point, they started to recruit wealthier Romans. And at that point, the idea that the poor only can be part of the Christian community, or they only can inherit the future world, becomes a problem, because these are wealthy people. So the Matthew version actually is an attempt to revise slightly the text and adapt it to the new influx of the wealthy. The wealthy also played a useful role, because the early Christians did have a communist outlook on life. Equality, sharing out the goods, a community spirit of these groups. And it was a kind of primitive communism that was there, but the problem that Kautsky points out, it was a communism of consumption and not a communism of production. And the problem is, you can consume in a communist way wealth, but somebody has to produce it. In Roman times, that wealth was produced on the basis of slave labour, and the wealthy had this wealth. If you recruited a wealthy Roman into the Christian community, he brought with him all his worldly goods. And if you managed to get him to believe that he had to share it with everybody, it allowed the early Christian communities to develop, to survive and develop. That meant the more that developed, the more you need to recruit wealthy people to share out these goods. And there's a limit to how far you can go with that. But it explains changes in the story. I mean, Kautsky actually gives very interesting references. For example, the figure of Pontius Pilate, who is presented as a man who washes his hands of condemning Jesus. Well, Pontius Pilate was a Roman. It's most likely Pontius Pilate, the actual Roman records of Pontius Pilate is that he had to be withdrawn as governor, because he was such a ruthless governor. He was so oppressive that he was actually fomenting rebellions amongst the Jews. And these were people who were oppressed by an empire. It's normal that people don't want to be oppressed by a foreign imperialist power. And there were rebellious forces amongst them. And but Pontius Pilate in the Gospel version appears almost as a good man. He washes his hands of this thing. He crucified so many Jews that he wouldn't have had a problem crucifying one more. But the story has changed in such a way that it's no longer the Romans who are to blame. All the Romans did was they asked the rabble, who were Jews, what do you want to do? And it was the Jews who had Jesus crucified. And therefore, then, as you recruited more and more Romans, we had no problems with Romans. You didn't do anything to Jesus, those terrible Jews. And that's been used ever since against the Jewish people. It would seem illogical to me that Jewish people would want somebody who, I mean, I'm not going into the details, may have led or not led poor people in revolts against the empire, and they say, no, we want our leader to be crucified and release the thief. It would have been most likely the way around. You've got to remember that the Gospels were written long after the events took place. And the stories, if you consider that the Christian community developed amongst the poorest layers, they would have been, in likelihood, mostly illiterate, and it would have been word of mouth. Now consider it, a lot of the Gospels were written in the 2nd they were written around about the 2nd century, it's a different moment, 2nd and 3rd century. They weren't written in 33 AD. They were written down later on, stories passed down from one to another. And the versions that we've received can't be considered as historical records of fact. And they were handwritten and hand-copied from generation to generation. And the versions that survive end up being the versions that fit the dominant idea within a church, which at a certain point, the church is no longer the church of the oppressed, of the poor, but becomes the official church of the state. And it transforms itself from the original communist, in the sense of idea of sharing and equality, into an instrument of an oppressive state over the people. And the idea that goes with it is, you accept your lot today because you will be rewarded when you die. Then justice will be made, will be done, and the poor, as I say, they will inherit, etc., etc. But while you're alive, this gives you the idea that my oppression now, I can live with it because I know that one day justice will be done. And it's a very useful idea if you can use it and inculcate it into millions of people, because it gives you the idea that nothing can be done really to change this world, because this world is dominated by men and women, and it's not God that rules this world. He's given us the free will to do what we want in this world, and we make a terrible mess of it. But once we die, God will do justice. Now, that's useful in making people think that the struggle is not join a union and strike for better wages. It's not build a party and overthrow the government that's oppressing you and change society, or things like, for example, the food crisis that we have at the moment. Is it about not enough food and too many people? Well, I'd invite you to read our website. Last week we published an article. Figures from The Guardian. It's not a Marxist plot, or we're inventing the figures. The Guardian showed quite clearly that there's been no fall in overall food production. In fact, 2007 was a bumper harvest. The problem in places like Haiti is not that there's not enough food. It's that they used to produce 95% of the rice they consumed, and then America in particular, but the IMF imposed on Haiti policies which said you must reduce tariffs on imported food, which meant that the food from abroad would be able to compete with the local produce. They reduced the tariffs because they needed the loan, otherwise they wouldn't get the loan. The result was they've destroyed the local farming in Haiti. Now Haiti imports 75% of its rice, mostly from the United States. A nice little system to increase the profits of the American agro-industry. That's got nothing to do with natural calamities. It's to do with the class society we live in. Removing imperialism and the profit motive that dominates, that motivates capitalism, and you can, in actual sense, return to the original. In this I would agree, the original Christians who said we should share the wealth between people, but on a much higher level. Not the wealth, the limited wealth, even of the Roman Empire, but a wealth which today would have been unimaginable in those days. They've actually increased the amount of food produced in the world since the 60s per inhabitant of the planet. In the 60s, a UN report showed that the world was producing an average of 2,300 calories per head in the world, and in the 90s it was 2,700 calories. Food production has been growing faster than the population growth. You wouldn't believe that if you read the mainstream media and the general ideas they give you. The problem is one of distribution. Now, that problem can be solved simply by changing society. Removing capitalism, removing the profit motive, and saying the resources that are being produced by the mass of working people should be controlled by the people that produce those resources and shared out equally. I believe, we as Marxists believe that if you achieve that, then the need for a God, or the belief in a God, will gradually disappear. Because in reality, for many people, God is actually an escape from this terrible world that we live in. Now, the difference here is that my friend here, Peter, clearly believes that God has a role, otherwise he wouldn't be dressed the way he's dressed. And on many things we could probably agree about the terrible things that happen in the world. I think it's the way to solve these problems which I think we would differ on. But I'll leave it there, and then you can ask questions and Peter can make his points.
Thank you very much.